Okay, thank you. We're almost there. A few minutes to go and we're done for the day and done for the program. My talk today is really more of a thought-provoking talk, necessarily not showing any of our research, although research will be shown throughout our talk. My talk is about eye movements, in particular dysfunction of eye movements seen in patients with MTBI. Thank you to Nick and the team at Brain Injury for the invitation and the opportunity to talk. I'd jump at it. Why am I here? I come to you with experience as a clinician, as a chiropractor in fact. Over 20 years, we see a lot of concussion and related conditions in our office. I'm a researcher, actively involved predominantly in vestibular research, which is more to do with the inner ear and the balance parts of our brain and body. And also as an educator, actively talking to people on this very topic. Just as a disclaimer, obviously, for those of you that are potentially patients or people that have, or parents of family members that have concussions, I present this more as a thought-provoking talk rather than the hard facts of what you should be doing. I'll present to you things that I see in clinic, where the evidence is, and potentially and hopefully you can have a discussion amongst your practitioner peers, or if you are practitioners, maybe to consider some of these advancements in your care for patients with concussion. When we talk about eye movements, people immediately say to us, "Oh, but my eyesight is fine." We're not necessarily talking about vision or eyesight as such. We're really looking at the control of your eyes. So just keep that in mind as I go through this talk. Eye movements can look like many things. When we talk about eye movements, we're really talking about a number of these subdomains. We can talk about fixation. Fixation is the ability of the eyes to keep stable on an object. And really everything else is a subset of that. We can have vergence, where our eyes are fixated on an object as it moves close to our eyes, which is called convergence, or as they move away, called divergence. Pursuit or smooth pursuit is where our eyes are following, again, fixating on a target, but this time the target is moving slowly from side to side, up and down, or in any other direction. A saccade is the fixation of our eyes on an object as it jumps quickly from one point to another. Optokinetic is when we're looking at an object in a repeated environment. We have what we call vestibular ocular reflexes, where we're looking at an object as we're turning our head, and we have these other movements called VOR suppression, where as our head turns, we're following an object as our head turns, and this object is moving with our head. So there's a lot of these eye movements that we consciously or subconsciously perform on a day-to-day basis, and these are very much needed for us to move, to be able to walk upstairs, to be able to follow an object, to be able to drive. There isn't a task with your eyes open that you wouldn't have some degree of fixation or eye movement. So again, keep that in mind. It's been written for some time now, and there's actually a book written on this with the same topic. Eye movements are the windows of brain function. We often think of eye movements as being purely driven by certain muscles that are coordinated by parts of the brain. It goes a lot deeper than that. There's a whole field of psychology that looks at consciousness and behaviours and emotionality, and there are eye movements that are linked to that. So eye movements are really a way in which we can peer into the brain and see how the brain is functioning. The neurology behind eye movements is vast and still becoming untangled as we speak. Again, there are many significant textbooks and journals that have been written over many years that talk about which areas of the brain relate to certain eye movements. So I mentioned before about sort of the saccades or pursuits or convergence or divergence or vestibulocular. These are all orchestrated by different areas of the brain. And this has come from partly from some lesion studies or ablation studies that may have occurred in animal models where they may have in a laboratory excised or ablated a certain part of the brain, and they've looked at how has that affected the animal's eye movements. We see this with humans and those that have suffered from traumas like stroke, where we can identify which areas of the brain have been affected by the stroke, and we can see which eye movements have been affected as a result. There are conditions like Parkinson's, children's neurobehavioural disorders, and many other conditions that have very significant hallmarks of abnormal eye movements that relate to these areas of the brain. And more recently, obviously, with more functional imaging from fMRI or SPECT scans or otherwise, we can now see, if we get a patient to do certain eye movements, we can see certain parts of the brain light up. Obviously, speaking to a group that knows a bit about concussions and MTBI, we know there are historically typically three types of injuries that can occur to the brain, or at least the forces in which the head is can be injured. One is more of a linear or a translation type where the head gets hit from front, side, or directly on top. We have a rotation-based injury. I'll explain that in a moment. And then we have the impact deceleration. But it's more that rotary type of injury that I guess I see in practice that correlates with a lot of eye movement disorders. When we have a rotary type of injury, which is almost always the case, even a small degree of head rotation when there's an impact will cause a rotation. Now you've got to imagine we've got a fairly large melon on a relatively small, stable structure. Our spinal cord is tethered within our spinal column, and our brain is typically well supported within the cranium. But what isn't so supported is that area where we have a counter rotation between the top part, which is the cranium, and the spinal cord or shoulders, which is the lower part. And that rotation normally occurs around the brainstem. Now, for those of you who know your anatomy, brainstem is an area that houses a lot of our eye movement centres. A lot of the areas of the brain that control our eye movements, let alone those that control our autonomic centres, our pain perception, our vestibular centres, and many other things that we see as a result of traumatic brain injuries. So it's really that rotation that we see the correlates affect our eye movements, let alone obviously direct impact that occurs on our cortex. The evidence now is showing, particularly at least in the sports-related field, that that eye movements are now being part of the standard protocol of assessments. Historically, it's the balance test and the neurocognitive test. More recently, we're now starting to look at cervicogenic aspects, autonomic aspects, and including the vestibular and oculomotor. So the oculomotor assessment, or at least recognition, is now becoming embedded in our assessments of concussions. And there's many. I've just cherry-picked some of the research that supports that. Here in military aspects, we see a number of strong correlation between, or the presence of some oculomotor disturbances in patients with blast-induced traumatic brain injuries. And these include convergence insufficiency. This is the inability for the eyes to converge, both eyes to converge equally as an object moves close to the nose. Saccades and pursuits, as I mentioned, are the slow and the fast eye movements. Ocular asymmetry, so whether one eye sits higher or lower or in or out relative to the other eye. These are all very common findings that we find in practice and in research. Again, more evidence to say here that these results suggest vulnerability of smooth pursuit and saccade abnormalities in patients with traumatic brain injuries, and that eye tracking should be part of the protocol to assess. And again, we have further discrimination of aspects of each of these eye movements, from amplitudes to velocities to acceleration. Now, with the advent and the use of technology, we can better understand which parts or which eye movements or which aspects of eye movements are related or consistent with people who have had traumatic brain injuries. And this is a good paper that spoke about, again, when comparing a group of people without TBI to those with TBI and post-concussion syndrome, they found that saccades and smooth pursuits are impaired. Now, you understand the ability for us to follow or track words on a page, the ability for us to cross a road and to be able to navigate steps and cars or people coming towards us necessitates the ability for our eyes to stay focused on a target. Otherwise, we run the risk that we could fall and injure ourselves. We may lose balance, we may get dizzy symptoms or other concerns as well. This is an example of a patient, a 20-year-old patient who had post-concussion syndrome. And this is what abnormal eye movements can look like. We're using infrared goggles so we can accurately measure and record eye movements. This patient was looking at a large screen, and the only thing on the screen was a yellow dot. And that yellow dot was just smoothly moving along that screen, and the patient was asked, follow that dot. And there was nothing else for them to see. And hopefully you could see here, if I can repeat that, maybe not. Oh, there we go. Look how dysmetric or dysregulated those eye movements are. They should track smoothly from side to side. You can see on many sweeps on the leftwards and rightwards, you can see those eyes jumping. And this is just one example of, and you can see that quite clearly there. And that's just an example of what we see as a result of traumatic brain injuries, amongst many other conditions, I should also add. So how do we measure it? A bedside assessment is where you have the patient in front and we're asking the patient, just track our finger from side to side, look at my finger as I move it from side to side, and we can do it in different directions. So that's a bedside low-tech assessment. Like most things, accuracy will also give you, I believe, better outcomes, and I'll show you in a moment a paper that suggests the same, but we can use these more high-tech tools. These are infrared goggles. So embedded in these goggles are cameras that record eye movements very accurately. The sensitivity of these things are extremely high, and we can document with various graphs exactly what is occurring other than just simply an observation. At least in the sports-related concussion field, there's good evidence to say that unless you have technology, you are likely to miss a lot of the subtleties that can occur with eye movements unless you have technology to record it. And this is the sort of recordings that we can see. This is referred to as a video nystagmography. Big word, all it means is basically to record eye movements very accurately using infrared goggles. Another bit of technology that we can use is where we have a computer screen which has a camera embedded. We ask the patient to read a set of text on the screen, and as the patient reads, we can detect and record how they're moving their eyes across the screen. Are they saccading or pursuing their eyes accurately as we expect? It's one thing to measure someone's eyes and say, well, look, you're 12 degrees out of position or alignment, or you're a bit slower here, but the reality is for most people that want to know, can I read? Can I do daily activities well? And this is a great test that enables us to qualitatively and quantitatively measure eye movements. There are some low-tech but validated tools that we can use in practice. There's one that's called the Kindivic test, which is a time test that a patient has to read each of these numbers as they go across the screen, and then it's timed. And obviously this is an easier set. This is a more challenging where we don't have the lines in between. and then this becomes much more difficult where there's a lot of similarities between each of these lines. Someone who has an ocular motor or eye movement dysfunction will struggle to keep reading along a line. All right, so this is a very low-tech way to time and record their eye movements. The other is the VOMS test, which is the vestibular ocular motor screen test, which uses it's a subjective measure, so it's asking how the people feel when they're doing a series of tests. Most of it is eye-based or head movement-based. Again, standardised, and it's one that's now forming part of a normal battery of tests. If eye movements are found to be part of your profile with someone with concussion, then eye movement therapy is generally being shown to be quite helpful. And there are many professions that use it now. You can use cards, and you can use follow my finger from side to side. There are some technology with an iPad or otherwise that you could use, that you could program different directions or angles or distances between stimulus to help essentially train your brain to have better function. And that's what this is. This is not even though it's called eye movement therapy, we're not simply looking at improving the muscles of your eyes. The reality is we're trying to improve people's brain function. Virtual reality now is showing some promise to be able to provide this, and even in a home-based environment as well. With an augmented reality environment, we can change different targets that the patient may see. Obviously, we can make that target quite difficult, like walking through a shopping centre or in a lift or in a car. These are things that people often say to us, is that, I feel okay in the office, but I don't feel so great when I'm in a shopping centre, or I'm walking the street, or I'm a passenger in a car. If we can augment that and train someone's brain to be more resilient to that and more adaptable, we're hitting more targets. And finally, where some of the more recent promise is shown is that we can target these brain networks. So not necessarily eye movements, but we can target the networks of the brain that are involved in controlling eye movements by using different forms of neuromodulation. And they can include low-level laser or photobiomodulation. Can also include transcranial direct current, TMS, and many other things as well. Starting to come through the research has been an opportunity where we can prime the brain or get the brain ready for therapy. And in clinic, we find that if we do both, we juice up the brain ready for some care, and we give our eye movement therapies along with other things that we often find with concussion. We seem to get some good results. Some of the research that I'm involved with, some of the autonomic capacities and features of concussions, and we'll be doing more of this as part of our research. But this is, as I said, this is more of a thought-provoking talk, one that I share with you as a clinician, and one that I see, and hopefully it sparks some questions. And finally, be sure to love your brain. Thank you.